Hello and good morning to everybody to day one of our opening session of this year's Summit, a Festival of Ideas. My name is Jeremy Porteus. I'm the founder and the chief executive of the Housing Learning and Improvement Network, or Housing LIN for short. And our small team has pulled together a fabulous week-long programme of online events with over 40 expert speakers who've given up their time to share their ideas, knowledge and expertise to help inform and improve your sector learning and understanding. Indeed, nearly 600 people have signed up to join us across this week, and we anticipate this will attract at least nearly 2,500 live streams. And as Sally has mentioned, this can be further amplified on social media. So do please use X or Twitter and the hashtags and the handles that were on the screen. More about the speaker profiles can be found on the Summit microsite. This year's Summit is our fourth event and a virtual event in recent years, and the 12th annual conference in total. Formerly responsible for the Department of Health's Housing with Care capital programme and using a network approach to support policy implementation, over the last decade or so, we've continued to be at the forefront of knowledge transfer to influence strategic thinking and bring together a range of practitioners to test out and inform operational delivery across specialist and supported housing and technology-enabled care in particular. From happy to tappy, all the themes that we'll be unpicking this week with our speakers. Before I still go on to the session itself, I just want to say a really big thanks to all our sponsors, both our headline sponsors and our associate sponsors. This summit, and indeed many of our networking, communication and activities throughout the year would not be possible without their support. So we really appreciate their ongoing commitment to the values of the Housing LIN. Much appreciated. Now, turning on to this session, can I just take this opportunity to thank ExtraCare Charitable Trust, and we're joined by Michael and Jim, who I shall be handing over to shortly, for their support and the team behind the scenes. So again, Michael, thanks again for your support, for enabling us to run this session, exploring the future landscape of ExtraCare housing, innovations, challenges and emerging trends. And in fact, later on, we'll hear from Richard Webb, from Director of Adult Social Care and Health and Adult Services at North Yorkshire Council, because indeed, towards the end of last year, he also ran an event looking at the past, present and future of ExtraCare. So we want to follow on from that theme. But in a minute, we'll be joined by Jim Leftwich, a resident ambassador at the ExtraCare Charitable Trust, and Michael. In fact, I'll probably hand over to Michael first, and you can make the introduction. Then we'll be joined by Vic Rayner, by Helen Whately, the Minister of State for Social Care at the Department of Health and Social Care, and as I said, followed by Richard. Helen Whately isn't with us at the moment. For those of you who are eagle-eyed and looking at the panel members, she's going to join us just after 11 o'clock. So we look forward to welcoming her. But in the meantime, both hear from Michael and Jim to kick off this session. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I'm just going to share my slides with everybody. Thanks very much for having us here. And to begin with, I was really going to pretty much get straight over to Jim, really. I'm very fortunate to have Jim Leftwich with me today. Jim and I met last week to discuss a bit about our session, so I've already heard a bit about Jim's story, which I found absolutely fascinating. Jim's from our Hewitt and Gardens village in High Wycombe. And I put a few questions to Jim last week about some of the things that I thought we could draw out about his story. And so if I hand over to you, Jim, I think the first question I'd actually asked you last week when we met was, when did you have that first thought to actually move into a retirement village? When did it first crop up in your mind? When did it all happen?
It happened as recently as last year. We've only been here at Hewenden for 7 months, and we only thought of it back in this time last year, February last year. Should I flow on, Michael, into part of it? Yeah. As background, back in 2010, when my wife and I were in our early 70s, we downsized from a 6-bedroom house to a 4-bedroom house, personally designed by ourselves, for ourselves. It's 4-bedroom, 4-bathroom, his and her bathroom, underfloor heating. We had everything we could want. we're still doing lots of international travel, leading groups to Kenya twice a year, who needed to think about buying an apartment. You know, life was good. 12 years on, though, the landscape started to look different. We were still fit and healthy, but we'd stopped making our travels to Kenya. Fewer visitors. The grandchildren were now no longer children, weren't staying over with us. And in February of last year, my wife and I sat down, had a really good deep discussion, reflecting on how fortunate we'd been, all that we'd seen and done in our life. And here we were in a dream home. But then both of us admitted neither of us wanted to be alone in that house, as one day we would be if we did nothing about it. So we phoned some friends we had down here at Hughenden Gardens. We'd never been in there, never really had a full awareness of what it had to offer. Came down and they took us around. We liked what we saw and heard, immediately booked for a sales tour, which we did. We liked an apartment that was available at that time, put a deposit down, put our house on the market, and 6 weeks later, our house was sold and we moved in at the end of July last year. So that was our route into it, and very much predicated on the basis of life was going to change for us. It was inevitable and we needed to prepare for it. Our friends' reactions were very interesting, because we are part of a really large group of people, all age range, but the 40 to 60-year-olds, their reaction was, I wish our parents would have a discussion like that. And which I think was very telling in terms of not just marketing to people already in retirement, but looking at how one gets the younger member of the families to really think that through. Michael, you did ask me as well how you thought we compared to others, why we were so willing to make the move. Well, our life, as I said, had been a very fortunate one, in the sense that it really was a charted out life with myself and my wife. We moved a lot in pursuit of my career. We've actually lived in 6 different counties in this country and in the United States for 2 years. So moving had no terrors for us. We've moved many, many times. Whereas our friends, it seemed, even though all the 70, 75-year-olds that have been along to visit us, the blockage there for them is the thought of moving after 30 to 40 years in their house. The mindset is one of, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for them, and it wasn't a challenge for us. But all I would say to anyone in that situation, the benefits are so much greater than the challenge of moving. And if you don't move, you leave it to your children to sort out all your clutter of all those years, which many have done, of course. Our experience here has been unbelievably better than we'd anticipated. We thought it would be good. It's almost difficult to put into words the sense of freedom and liberation, not just because we don't have a garden to do and I don't have to chase around after maintenance for the house and so on. There's just something about it that frees up. The fact that our children are delighted that we've moved, we're delighted. And the comments of our friends generally is one of, you're so relaxed. You look so much, you're enjoying life, which we are. We got every opportunity to stay fit as long as is possible, but we know somewhere along there will be a change. But in terms of staying fit, again, I hadn't anticipated this advantage in making this monumental sacrifice of coming down from his and her bathroom to a single bathroom. What that's done for us, my wife has first use of, I go out for a 1 mile walk. If the weather's fine, I walk up to Hughenden Gardens. If it's not, I can do a 1 mile walk along the corridors without retracing my steps. So it immediately sets the pattern for the day. I go to the gym 4 or 5 times a week for half an hour. So I'm busy working on the computer, I want a break. I go down to the gym. My wife is now going to yoga and keep fit. And we're back dancing again, courtesy of the regular cabarets that we have on. And I would ask anyone who's watching this, as I've asked many of our friends, what did you do on New Year's Eve? Sit in front of the television with a drink, perhaps, watching the fireworks? Well, my wife and I danced the night away to Shawadi Wadi. I mean, how's that for living? And it's so unbelievably better than we realised. So when we think of the route, and I've talked to one of the residents here who did this, she and her husband downsized to a 2-bedroom bungalow, and he died about a year later. And there she was, left to rattle around in that until her daughter-in-law persuaded her to come here. Best thing she ever did, wished they'd done the move straight away. And my wife and I certainly feel, had this been here in 2010, had we had an awareness of what was possible, then the chances are we wouldn't have downsized from that 6-bedroom house then. We'd have probably waited 5 years and then come straight to this. That's how impressive it is for us. You also, if I can flow on then, Michael, because you also asked the question, going forward, how do we see things? Well, I think one of the reasons we feel so relaxed is because from a personal point of view, we're in the right place no matter what happens. And I think all the core principles and practices here are really, really good. It's very hard to fault them from my point of view. But I do have a bit of a concern in the image, and I feel there's more we can do by ExtraCare Charitable Trust and the residents being more of a team, not a tenant-landlord relationship or an owner-leaseholder relationship. The concept is so good. I think we should be trying to sell this together as a joint enterprise rather than, as I say, as 2 separate bodies. It's perhaps ingrained in some people, but to hear people talk almost of a them and us, it's just so unnecessary. The opportunity is there to do it together. And one of the thoughts that has certainly occurred to me, I have a friend, a lady friend, my wife knows all about her, we've known for years, who at 85 is captain of a bowls team. And we have bowls here, we have curling here, we have people playing table tennis, but I'm not aware of a Hughenden Gardens team or of people coming in to play us or us going out to play them. Now, I think one of the big things about well-being is, and I practiced at work, my very successful career was about managing major change. And the thing I did was to try and involve people at every level so there's a sense of belonging, and belonging gives you good well-being. And I think if we work together much more as a joint enterprise, that's my only criticism of it. There's more potential than is being realised at the moment.
Thanks so much, Jim. Especially on that last point, I really appreciate having you here with me today, because I think it's such a better way to put across the realities of living in the village, having you here rather than just me speaking on my own. The few things I'll go into myself, being the Wellbeing Research and Innovation Lead Manager, the things that we need to keep doing to make sure that we build communities and run them well, so that all those things that Jim was just talking about actually happens. The word innovation sometimes kind of keeps me up at night, because I always think, oh God, what do we need to kind of come up with next? What does the next kind of big idea need to be? And often I think it probably goes the other way around with the innovations and the challenges. We have the challenges first, and we try and innovate our way out of the challenges. We try and come up with new ways of doing things to overcome some of the challenges that we face running a retirement community. Quite like this phrase when it comes to innovation, breaks it down quite nicely for me. When you've got the word innovation in your job title as well, that can be a bit scary to think of what do we need to do next to make things, better and better and better. And I've been with ExtraCare around 16 years now. And in all that time, there's lots of different things that we've done. There's a few examples on the screen here. In lots of different areas: bereavement, dementia, mental well-being, our Engaged Lives project, trying to help people to be more socially connected within our schemes and villages. Our villages can be huge. There can be about 300 residents or more living in one of our settings. And we want someone being on their own to be a choice. The way Jim was just describing the village there and his experience of it is very, very social. And then there'll be pockets of people in a village that might struggle with confidence, and particularly people on their own who've experienced a bereavement, engaging in the community, coming to those events on New Year's Eve. So we've done a lot of projects around trying to bring people out of their shells more. When I met Jim last week, one of the things that really stuck with me was actually how far he and his wife had thought ahead. They'd even thought about what would things be like when maybe one of us is on our own. And again, the gold standard framework, which we introduced a few years ago in ExtraCare, really highlighting advanced care planning, thinking about end-of-life care, thinking about what might I need if I'm to be on my own, and what might I need actually at my own end of life, and what do I want that to look like. Quite difficult topics. And I think that's one of the things that impressed me with Jim. You don't seem scared of the big topics, neither you or your wife did. You really thought ahead. I don't think everyone does that. And I think that can be a real problem. So there's lots of things that we've tried to do in ExtraCare to try and encourage that kind of thinking, helping people to think much, much further ahead of what they might actually need. Here's a few of our most recent innovation projects that I can share with you. This first one, Show Me Your Meds project. We were very fortunate for one of our wellbeing advisors, Sarah Drayton, to work with a local GP around something really quite common, but medication prescribing, what our medications our residents are taking, how often they're getting their medication reviewed, how the kind of adherence that residents have to their medication. It's such a common thing that many older people are taking multiple medications, but who was helping people? Who was trying to help people keep a handle on it and make sure people were taking the right things at the right time? So this project, which only lasted for 6 weeks in one of our villages, highlighted lots of different things to us about how actually people really aren't having decent medication reviews and where we can actually help as an organisation. Just in this 6-week project in Bristol, 10.3 kilograms of unused medication. The wellbeing advisor and our asset management team actually created this eco corner in the village where residents could actually dispose of their unused stockpiled medication. And on there, so something like 515 individual months of prescriptions had not been taken. So for us, when it comes to our residents' well-being, that can translate into, poor health, falls, people unnecessarily going into hospital and having to leave their home in the village and go somewhere even for a few weeks for treatment, or sometimes permanent transitions of care from things that could have been completely avoidable. There was a real environmental benefit as well to this eco corner. From quite a small project, something that was quite simple, this is now something that we're trying to roll out across all of our villages to really try and focus on the health of our residents. If we want residents to live with us for a long time and have a good time, people need to be as happy and healthy as possible. So our wellbeing service massively focuses on that. We've tried to extend our wellbeing service as well through student healthcare placements. We've been doing these for a couple of years now in a big way. Last year, we actually welcomed 73 healthcare students. Normally, they're students who are in their final year of study. nursing students, occupational therapy and physiotherapy. Our wellbeing advisors can do a great deal for residents, but these are very specialist disciplines and we need that external support. We provide long arm supervision for the students, but they give us and our residents a massive amount of support. And we've had a lot of good feedback to say that it was a nice varied placement for them too. If we referred a resident to an occupational therapist in the community, the resident could be waiting 10 weeks before they get to see somebody. Whereas if we have a student on site, the student can work with the resident, get to know them, and actually even order equipment for the resident, which would then be signed off by our in-house long arm supervisor. So it's another way that we're trying to improve the health and well-being of our residents so people can stay with us for longer and stay healthier and happier for longer. When it comes to the technology side of things, we have some very interesting projects, and these themselves have been going on for a couple of years now. The smart market. So in the picture there, we have Kerry and Oliver. They actually travel around to all of our different schemes and villages and set up a stall in the village centre, and they highlight a variety of different technology to residents that they might be able to use to keep themselves independent as possible. Amazon Alexas is a really, really common tool that might be becoming quite popular with residents. For instance, at my age now, I've started using a lot of smart tech, partly because of Kerry and Ollie as well. I'll probably age using that technology and finding ways to keep it independent, whereas many of our residents at the moment might not have come across these technologies before. So if they get the opportunity to pick up something that they see, that they think is interesting, Kerry and Ollie can work with that resident to try and integrate it into their home. How are they going to use it every day, and how could it be most useful? They found an interesting app called If This Then That, and if they learn a resident's routines, such as if I get up between the hours of 11:30 and 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm probably going to the bathroom. So when the sensor knows that I've gotten out of bed, I want it to turn the hallway light on and I want it to turn the bathroom light on, avoiding things like falls and such around the home. There's lots of different ways that quite simple technology can be utilised. And it's actually all fitted into one of our apartments in Solihull Village called our Smart Apartment or our Innovation Apartment. That apartment is full of all sorts of different technology where residents or visitors, if any of you are local or would like to travel to Solihull Village, you're more than welcome to come and have a look at the apartment, see how can we use everyday technology to make somebody's life easier. And even avoiding some care calls for some of those kind of like simple prompts like medication prompts and such. How can we actually make the person feel more independent in their own home? The team recently run an award, a Health Investors Award for best use of technology in senior housing. And I think the main reason they won that award is because it's a simple idea. They're trying to find simple things, simple solutions to actually very, very common problems, but problems that mean that a person's health might deteriorate a lot quicker, or a person might end up in hospital. That's a big thing that we're trying to avoid through a lot of the work that we do. And technology has been a big part of that. When we think about our residents, I tend to think of these three areas. I'm a big fan of the biopsychosocial model. We need to think about the residents' health, physical health. What can we actually do to support the people to stay as physically healthy as possible? We've started to do a lot more around psychology in the last few years, factoring in things like mindfulness and cognitive behavioral principles into a lot of the work that we do. Thinking in a balanced and healthy way is really, really important, particularly when it comes to, managing our health. And the social element as well is absolutely massive. Sometimes the village itself, just by actually building the building, creates a great social space for our residents. It can also then be what people make of it. On the health side of things, we've noticed things change quite a lot. So our wellbeing service last year actually saw close to 10,000 drop-ins to the wellbeing advisor, whereas pre-pandemic we were seeing around about 3,000. So it's massively changed. We do find residents are struggling to get hold of a GP or use services externally. So the wellbeing advisors are picking up an awful lot, and we want to continue being there for our residents to keep people as healthy as possible. That's one of our big challenges at the moment. Other challenges, a thing that I commonly hear, older people who may benefit don't know who we are. They don't know who we are, and they don't necessarily know what we are. They don't necessarily know what a retirement village is. Jim was really proactive and thought ahead and thought, actually, what might I need in the future? I don't know if everyone's always in a place to do that. Another thing that struck me about Jim's story was how often Jim and his wife have moved. They'd really become quite acclimatized to kind of moving from one home to the other. Jim told me last week that he doesn't see kind of home as the actual building. He sees it as you create the home, him and his wife are the home, and they can be at home anywhere. So it was maybe a bit easier for them to make that move. I think we need to try and help people think like that and think what the possibilities could be of moving into a retirement setting, rather than people maybe just seeing what they might be losing by selling that family home in the community. And there's probably lots of different places where you can find statistics like this. I got some of these from the MHA website, actually. And although the statistics might vary from place to place, I think the message is quite similar. There's a lot of older people in the UK, 15.5 million people over 60, a big percentage of the population. How much are people thinking about the future? And the Elderly Accommodation Council releasing some information around just the volume of retirement housing that might be in the UK. I think it's quite clear that the volume that we have perhaps doesn't really match the need. So I think actually Jim's right. Between ourselves and our residents, we can probably do a lot of campaigns around what are the benefits of retirement housing, why do we need more of it, and what could it actually offer the UK as a whole, really. Thanks very much for your time this morning, and thank you for joining me as well, Jim. That's everything I was going to go through with you, and back to you, Jeremy.
Well, on behalf of the LIN and everybody watching, a big thanks to you and Jim in particular. A really inspiring opening, and I know several questions coming into the chat box for you both, and we'll answer those in due course. But what I was struck about was not just about the pretty buildings and what you showed in terms of Hewland Gardens, and what Jim articulated was this sense of belonging, and it's more about the social architecture. So I was very struck by both of you in terms of your personal approach, but also the social and the well-being issues that you described in terms of the psychological aspects as well. And I hope we can come back to that. But I'm going to move on now to Vic. And Vic, it's lovely to have you with us this morning too. Vic is the Chief Executive of the National Care Forum and a long-time collaborator on a number of projects with the Housing LIN and before. So Vic, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I'm delighted to be here and have a chance to firstly hear that fantastic opening presentation from Jim and Michael, and secondly to talk about innovation and challenges and some of the future, which I'm very interested in and really keen to think about. So I thought what I would do, Jeremy, with your permission, is to go a little bit more future focused, because I'm very interested in technology. I've done lots of work within the National Care Forum. We're a membership body for not-for-profit care providers. Delighted ExtraCare Charitable Trust are one of our members, alongside a lot of other not-for-profit organisations who focus very much on innovation and focus very much on technology and driving forward. But I think that we've got a sort of another big leap potentially coming in the future. So I wanted to reflect a little on some time I'd spent in the States about 18 months ago, looking at how particularly the use of robotics was happening in the kind of extra care, or what they would call, retirement housing environment there, partly to sort of challenge and push people's perceptions a little bit, and also happy to take all the kind of comments from people who say, never in my lifetime, or others who may be very interested and excited by it. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time doing that. I'm going to share my screen, if I may, and I will whip you through some slides and start at the beginning, ideally. So can you see that all right? Yeah, great. Okay, so I just want to, so as I say, I spent some time in the States and I was looking at particularly some of the applications of robots in extra care or retirement housing. And I mean, I think one of the common agendas here, and I know we're talking about sort of innovations and challenges in the sort of in this sector, but these relate to some of the comments that Michael and Jim were making earlier around the kind of population and particular challenges around workforce across the care side of the extra care environment, as well as the hospitality and all sorts of other areas. And of course, we're not unique in that as a country. We have a very significantly aging population that has a almost immediate impact on the demography of the working age population. So we have a working age population that's shrinking and an aging population that is growing in proportion. So we do have to look very seriously at some alternatives for frontline staff. But I'm interested to see that there were not only addressing sort of staffing issues, but there were some very positive benefits in it in terms of how the people receiving or living within those services felt. So the particular focus here, and this was, across a range of presentations and inputs from organisations, the primary usage of robotics was in the context of serving. And this is something called a maitre d' robot. And it was being particularly utilised where in localities where people were really struggling to recruit staff. So you can see that it has serving trays on it, and it will bring the food to the particular tables, very much accompanied with people within the serving space. So the robot was doing the hard legwork of taking the food back and forward and then bringing it to the table where people were then served by a human. The person who was front of house could maintain a lot of communication and conversation with people rather than rushing back and forward. So those were seen as benefits in that sense. The particular robot here, this is one called Levo. So it's autonomous. It can be programmed very significantly. So if it's serving 2 or 3 people at a table and they maybe have specific dietary requirements or particular things, or there's a particular monitoring of their diet, for example, the robot can be programmed in order to move around the table and serve the particular food to somebody in the right space or place. There was a lot of focus on increase in relation to efficiency. In the research that they'd done, actually people who were receiving the food felt that it was a much more, their satisfaction was increased because of it, perhaps potentially because it was more efficient and they got the food warm and on time. And staff particularly, there was a great sense of increased satisfaction because they weren't spending their time back and forwards in and out of the kitchen to collect food. And from a recruitment and retention point of view, in a very intensely competitive environment, they were finding that this was giving them a competitive advantage to retain staff. So some interesting kind of learning around that. The driving forces there were definitely around staffing. Not just the fact that they couldn't get people, but then people who were coming in were not finding the role satisfying. And of course, emerging technology. And I think this is something where I was very struck, and I'll come back to Jim again a little later, but very struck by the kind of skill set that Jim was talking about. He was deploying in his paid work before retirement. So that idea of housing and particularly care, having that sort of skill set of being able to transform, to look at new technology and to think about how it can be applied. I think we've got a lot of skill development to do in that context. There are leading organisations like the ExtraCare Charitable Trust who are investing in staff, in Ollie and Kerry and other staff to bring technology to people's attention. But there's not enough of that, and the skills of the staff within these organisations are not geared around a kind of engineering focus, around a kind of very significant change management focus. And some of this is what is needed in order for us to be able to take advantage of some of these new technologies on the horizon. I was really interested in the examples that Michael gave of Alexa. Often people talk about technology in the context of wearables and others. None of these have been particularly developed with an older people's market in mind, and yet they have massive applications in that context that we should be thinking about enhancing and using. So these are some of the reasons, and this is, I'm shamelessly drawing this from some of the American organisations who have been further ahead in looking at this. And they're also thinking where further. So I talked about this being very much focused on serving, but there are lots of other potential applications in the pipeline. So definitely around that kind of environmental service. So in that kind of context, cleaning, keeping an environment safe, and I've seen robots being used in terms of kind of delivering various items around a residential setting, a retirement village, whilst at the same time then being able to have a sight on whether anybody is within the corridors who shouldn't be, etc. Deliveries definitely there. Artificial intelligence, so this is an area, again, we don't have a huge amount of knowledge about within the housing and care sector, but just earlier this month we had a big summit where a new sort of ethical focus around artificial intelligence was being developed. And artificial intelligence in this context would be about learning what people want, how they want things done, and then being able to deliver to their needs, and a very personalised response in that side. And of course, resident interaction. Many of you will have seen various iterations of that in the context of Paro, the robotic seal, some of the robotic dogs, etc. I was in Liverpool the other day and seeing the Boston dog, the quadruped, who can move in the most extraordinary ways, and think about how those kind of things could be used in the care sector. Often a question about care, about robotics, is about return on investment. So in this context, this is again an example from the States. They were able to have that discussion about, is there a significant return on investment? They were able to utilise one robot. This is again a serving robot, a maitre d' robot, and that was equivalent to 2 staff who were involved in serving. This is a comparison of the wage rate. So they were paying staff $13 an hour. So without those staff, they were saving $36,000, nearly $39,000, and a robot was $22,500. And so each of their communities in this particular provider's context had two robots, and that was saving them $20,000, $30,000 and getting some of those kind of other efficiency gains that were talked about. Now, you have to create a market for some of this. So when we talk about robots, often in the UK, the price point is very high. So it is about creating a significant enough market for people to bring that price down. And also in the States, they got to a stage where people were able to lease robots. So they got sufficient market for people to be able to do that. Now, here's to the skill set, and I think some of the question and challenge about any kind of innovation or technology, and much to Michael's point about, innovation not just being, just grabbing, seeing the challenge and then finding something to do. We need to think very differently, because clearly robots are not going to solve all of our problems. We need to go through a significant process of re-engineering to ensure that any kind of automation, any kind of technology, and indeed any kind of innovation will create efficiency and reduce dependency in this context. So a bit of a sort of mind map for you. I'm hoping that slides are going to be shared. People can take this away and have a look at it. So this is about thinking, how do you take and break down each stage within the system, and then think about where, if, how a robot in this context, or indeed any other kind of technology, might be brought in. And so here we've got, the sort of stages along the top in the darker blue, the things that happen now in any kind of serving environment, and then where are the ways in which technology could be utilised to bring in greater efficiency and greater satisfaction. And in this context, certainly the experience that was being presented was a rare triple win. So there was increase in resident satisfaction. They got more quicker service, they got more face time with people who were delivering the frontline service, and a small increase in customer satisfaction. Staff felt very much more that they were getting more fulfilling work. They were doing much less working time, they were walking time, they were going home less tired. And there was a cut of staff hours, front of house staff hours, equivalent over the year to 7 full-time equivalent staff. And they as an organisation, and these are, again, not-for-profit organisations in this context, have reinvested those dollar savings into the staff, an increase for the front of house staff. So people didn't go, but the role that they played was very different in that context. So, of course, technology is not the only transformation on the horizon, and I can see that the Minister has joined now and will undoubtedly be talking about some of the other kind of transformations in the future. And I've picked on that in a way just to kind of stimulate a bit of debate about how people feel about innovation and change in that context. But there are lots of things coming that we, as a cohort, as a group of people passionate about the role of ExtraCare housing and the role of housing generally, need to be really aware of. So the needs of the communities of the future are changing very significantly. Jim's story of making the kind of change that he and his wife did at a time when they could do that and could make that plan for that, as Michael said, is not usual. We still have not got to the stage where people are coming with confidence into this environment. And of course, we know that generally there are a growing level of complexities of health needs of individuals living in the community, and often for all sorts of services, people are coming into them at a point where they are sometimes less well, less able to connect, less able to take advantage of some of the great opportunities there. We know that there are very significant environmental changes coming. It was really, again, interesting to listen to people in the States who were running retirement villages in parts of Florida, for example, that had been completely sort of wiped out with hurricanes and flooding. And we know that the climate is changing significantly. So being aware and prepared for what that might look like, and applying some of that kind of process re-engineering to creating environments that are fit for long-term futures with that climate change and regulatory requirements around it, the environment coming down the line. I mentioned around the changing demography, and of course we know, we hope that will drive a greater and more laser-like focus on what older people's provision needs to look like in the future and what people want and how they can get that. But alongside that, we have to have this really real conversation about a shrinking workforce generally, and therefore what we think workforce requirements will look like in the future. Do we need an army of Ollie and Kerrys being able to go and support people to apply the technology that they might need to retain their independence within their own home? And do we need a whole set of other roles which help people to manage their polypharmacy issues or their long-term health conditions that are, that they're not going to get from acute services? And of course, we've got Richard in shortly talking about some of the kind of changes around commissioning and what the Commissioner's view of the future will look like. So hopefully that's helpful, Jeremy, just to have a few thoughts around what some of those changes might look like.
Oh, Vic, really great. And I think what I love about what you've shared with us this morning is that move between ExtraCare to e-care or virtual care, and what the scope could be for the robotics, both in terms of being much more person-centered and linking into that resident satisfaction. You made those really important points about the workforce, and I'm sure Helen, and welcome Helen, is something that Helen's championed, issues around workforce and her role as a Minister for Social Care. And I think the other thing, that environmental change, the impact of climate, but also not just for care efficiency, but also how we construct our homes as well, and whether we'll have more robotics in our design, construction, off-site manufacture. And that's another conversation we'll have later on when we do the Q&A. But for now, Vic, thanks very much. Well, Minister, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you, and thanks very much for joining us in your busy schedule this morning. We've heard from a resident, Jim, about living in ExtraCare, a very inspiring presentation. We've heard about the importance of wellness. We've heard a bit about technology. over to you about really, you're setting the scene around sort of the older person's housing task force and the broader agenda for government. Thanks very much for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you very much for inviting me to join you today virtually. I'm sorry, I know you've juggled the schedule a little bit. There's been a landslip in southeast England and Kent, which somewhat affected my journey in just very practically. But so thank you for accommodating me. And you've clearly got a fantastic group of people involved in this event today. Tons of expertise, which is brilliant to see. You mentioned the word workforce, as did I think Vic. I'm actually going to focus on talking about housing today, though. I spend, I think, quite a lot of my time talking about the care workforce. I care enormously about it, but I am going to try and stick to the topic and talk on this occasion much more about housing and some of the work we're doing on housing, and particularly the older people's housing task force. One thing to draw on, many people on this call may have seen. If not, I would recommend you to have a look because it's excellent. The Chief Medical Officer's annual report last year, and one of the things he said in that was that one of the triumphs of modern medicine and public health is that a great majority of people are living into older age, clearly something to be celebrated. But it also means that we have a responsibility in government and wider society to plan for that demographic change and to support people to age healthily, independently, and indeed enjoyably. The government is committed to helping people live fuller, more independent lives for longer. And those principles are clearly set out in our vision for social care reform. And in that vision, we acknowledge that a big part of delivering on that commitment means making sure that we have the right housing available to people to meet their needs. Part of that is making sure that people are living in homes that are set up to safely support them and their needs. And that could be, those things that we all know so much about, features like stair lifts, but equally smaller changes of grab rails, actually putting in technology, or in fact simply fixing hazards like rugs and broken steps and things like that. That's why, and it's very everyday stuff, but we have provided extra funding to support those kind of adaptations for people. In fact, and not everybody knows this, so I shall spell it out a bit. Since 2010, the government has invested £5.4 billion, £5.4 billion into the Disabled Facilities Grant, delivering an estimated 550,000 home adaptations in England. So that's over 500,000 home adaptations with that funding. We know these adaptations clearly good for people's quality of life, but also reduce emergency admissions in hospital and the back and forth that can mean, and can prevent people needing to move into residential care, which is both expensive and clearly not what many people want. We also know in government that for some of us, the nature of our care and support needs will mean that we need supported housing specifically designed to support independent and healthy living. That's why the government is supporting the delivery of new supported housing by providing capital subsidies to providers through the Care and Support Specialised Housing Fund, sometimes known as CASH, and the Affordable Homes Programme in England. And these are all important public interventions, but to achieve our ambition to reform adult social care, we need to go further, and we need to think about how we can offer older people a better choice of accommodation to suit their changing needs, and indeed make sure that there is the supply of the right kind of accommodation there, which means supporting the growth of a thriving older people's housing sector across the country. And that leads me to the Older People's Housing Task Force. Last year, the Department of Health and Social Care and the Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities launched the Older People's Housing Task Force. In fact, I launched on behalf of my department that task force together with my colleague, the Housing Minister at the time. Those of you watching or listening to this will know that there has been more than one housing minister since we launched that. But luckily, I have worked with each of the ministers in that post, and all have been very supportive and keen to move this forwards. The chair of the task force, Professor Julianne Mayer, she's unfortunately unable to be here with us today, but I know that she is working closely with many people on this call, and I thank all of you for your contributions to this. The purpose of the task force is to look at ways to increase supply and provide greater choice of housing for older people. On the one hand, examining the barriers that are getting in the way of that happening, and on the other hand, identifying the enablers and what we need to change to bring forward a greater supply and greater range of housing for older people. And specifically, when we set up the task force, we asked Professor Mayer to look at ways of firstly stimulating supply in terms of new supply of homes, but also in the sense of helping older people to live safely in their existing mainstream home, if that is what they choose to do. I think recognising, of course, that though we focus a lot on new build housing, actually the vast majority of people will be living in and likely to grow old in our existing housing stock. The new housing is only a small proportion of that. We also looked at the task force look at increasing consumer confidence and choice, empowering older people and their families, to consider the wants, needs and preferences of older people, families and carers. That's really important, building it around what people actually want and understanding what good looks like when it comes to older people's housing, including design quality and the use of smart technology. The task force is now 10 months into its 12-month review. In this time, I've been delighted to hear that Task Force has undertaken substantial engagement with stakeholders across health, housing and social care, including a comprehensive call for evidence, a series of strategic roundtables, site visits, and seeking the views of people with lived experience. And I know all of this is going to help the Task Force develop a strong and well-evidenced final report and recommendations. And I'm thrilled that Task Force is ensuring that people are right at the centre of all of their work. And this extensive engagement will help the task force further understand the current market for older people's housing in England today, and indeed actually looking into the future, and to identify and investigate the barriers that older people face when trying to access appropriate housing. The task force is now working hard to pull together its final report, drawing on lessons learned for the past, gathering the evidence, and ultimately delivering well-researched recommendations on the actions we need to deliver the future for older people's housing. And that task force will be sharing their final report in the coming months. So I know I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm sure many of you on the call will be looking forward to that as well. And say, I've seen some of the work in progress. It is really excellent stuff. It's just what we need. And I would like to actually take this moment to thank the task force chair, Professor Julianne Mayer, and all the members of that task force for the work to date and ongoing work on that. I also know that some of the discussion today will contribute, I'm sure, and be an excellent contribution to this work. So thank you very much for giving me a chance to share a little bit of what's going on there. Thank you, Jeremy, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of this event. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning, and apologies that you've had a landslip. I'm sure that's disrupted other plans as well. Are you able to stay just for 1 or 2 minutes longer, or do you need to shoot
I
up?
I can stay just for a few minutes. Yes, I think I've got to go by past. But yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, having been at the opening at Grace House in London, are there any things that you feel sort of can help inspire? You talked about technology, you talked about putting people at the centre. Are there other things that you've sort of come across that you feel are things we can sort of really sort of grab hold of and move forward and as we bring the sort of initial report to an end?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think, and I know you'll be drawing on, is there are often some great answers to the problems we face out there. People love looking internationally. It's always fascinating to look internationally, and we can look at what the Netherlands is doing. I always see things about the Netherlands. But often actually around the country, there's already really great stuff going on. And some of the questions sometimes, well, how can we make that kind of mainstream and make that the norm and happen sort of everywhere? The other thing I am really interested in is kind of what gets in the way of getting the right housing. And I said, it's easy to think about new build. I of course think about that, and you can point to all the kind of executive or family homes that are being built around the country. Definitely many in my constituency, and my constituents will say to me, hold on, we just want a bungalow to downsize to. We don't want a 3-bedroom executive home. And I think this is an interesting question, is what can we do to make sure that, yes, on our new build stock, we are building for the future, whether that's building homes for people to downsize into, but also actually making sure that the new build is actually sort of readily adapted and actually works for people if they are living with disabilities or potentially with extra care needs. But the other thing, as I sort of mentioned a moment ago, is crucially looking at, well, actually within our existing housing stock, how are we going to make this work as well? Because there's only so much you can do by getting the new build right. Clearly, we should get the new build right.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think had you heard Jim earlier, you would have heard his story, how he moved from a 6-bed to a 4-bed. But had he known about the availability of a place he could call home with his wife at an earlier stage, access to information, being aware as well. So again, how we can sort of put that into place as well. Those are sort of some of the challenges as well.
I tell you something I always think is really interesting. It's one of the things I've seen in some of the work from the Taskforce so far, is looking at when you're doing sort of town or city centre regeneration, looking at that for accommodation for older people and people with disabilities. Because actually, living right in the heart of the town, for instance, can be much better than out in a village. I think my constituency is clearly pretty rural. And it's really hard to keep the bus services going to the villages and things like that. And people clearly become very isolated. So where we are seeing the changing nature of town centres and change in the retail and with people moving online shopping, we all know the challenges of our high streets. Actually, well, what an opportunity to put accommodation for people with care and support needs or people who are older in your town centre, right on the doorstep. Then are all the services you need. You don't need to worry about the transport, and it can help clearly be good for town centre businesses, whether it's sort of shops and cafes as well, because you've got then your customers, right? Anyway, I think that's a really interesting vision for the future.
Yeah, and I think you're setting up Richard beautifully, because he the adult director of adult social care and health in North Yorkshire. He's got that combination of rural community and town centres as well across Harrogate, Knaresborough and the like. So we'll come back to you, Richard, in a moment. But can I, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's been a great contribution, and we certainly will take your challenge to us forward, thinking both during this summit about the new build as well as our existing stock. And I know that you've already stimulated some questions in the chat box and the Q&A. So thank you on behalf of us all, Helen.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry to rush off. Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Well, Richard, I'm going to hand over to you, because I wasn't sure whether you planned that, but I thought, that sort of issue about how to commission that Vic talked about, and knowing your sort of 10-year strategy, sort of that you're taking forward and how you've developed that has been really inspirational for the sector. And then that sort of balance between sort of rural and urban settings. I hope that's not too big an ask for you, but over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and good morning, everyone. And it's quite a tall order following actually so many great speakers. I've been really inspired by what I've heard this morning. So thank you for asking me to join you. I'm going to just attempt the technology now and hope my slides work. So can everyone see that okay? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I'd like to say a thank you to the HousingLIN. You've provided great support to so many of us and actually shared good practice, encouraged and challenged us along the way. Really, really appreciated that. And also, I just want to say a welcome for the Older People's Housing Taskforce. They actually came to visit us a few months ago, and we found it really thought-provoking having the conversation and looking forward to their final report as well, and the recommendations that come from that as well. So I'm going to talk a bit about the 20-year journey that we've been on here in North Yorkshire. So some of you will know North Yorkshire, others of you may have just seen it on television or kind of in the media. England's biggest rural county, our largest town, it's sort of 75,000 population. That's Harrogate. Scarborough's next with 50,000. But we're really a place of small market towns and villages and some breathtaking countryside. And the image would normally be that it's green and leafy and affluent, and that's very true in large measure. But also we have some really hidden, isolated pockets of deprivation, not only in coastal areas, but also in the rural parts of the county as well. And I often think, inequality really does exist here too. It just looks different from Leeds or Newcastle or Teesside or Manchester. So just a few sort of thoughts from our 20 years on the ExtraCare journey. So this is a map of the county. These are our current ExtraCare schemes, and also just a small number, I think it's 2 in total, 3, where we haven't been able to progress schemes for whatever reason, mainly issues around sort of changing local market or planning issues or site viability, to be honest. But we have 28 schemes now, we've got more in the pipeline, 1,540 units for a mix of rent and purchase, and we reckon that about 6,000 people have been through our schemes for their home over the last 20 years. And as befits the county of James Herriot, we have ExtraCare housing, both great and small. And 3 pictures here. The first on the left, hopefully on your left, is Bentham, that's Bowland View. Now, Bentham is a small market town right on the border of Lancashire and Westmoreland and North Yorkshire. And we've got a scheme there that Housing 21 developed. On the right-hand side, you've got the scheme at Castleton, right in the middle of the North York Moors National Park, small village and a small scheme. And in the middle, you've got a picture of the local constituency MP, who you may all know as the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, at Sycamore Hall, which is in Bainbridge, which is a village right near Hawes in the Yorkshire Dales. For those of you who know Wallace and Gromit, you'll know Wensleydale cheese made down the road in Hawes. Sycamore Hall replaced what was a council-run older people's home, and it's now also the home to the village shop, to the post office, to a library. I think the Women's Institute use the rooms there for their main meeting. So there's a real sort of fusion between the village and the ExtraCare scheme as well. What have we learned from the last 20 years? So in terms of the model, it's provided a range of different things. In some locations, it's the home for the local library. My great aunt lived in a scheme in a place called Stokesley, and we had the local library there. And I did some hot desking from there recently, and it was wonderful because you had all generations. You had, babies crawling around playing with the toy library, you had kids doing their homework, you had older people, there was a dementia group there, and they're linked, they're part of the site where the ExtraCare scheme is. A range of community facilities, I've talked about some of that already. In recent years in the north of the county, we've also introduced some NHS step-up, step-down beds, so hopefully to prevent people having to go into hospital, but also providing convalescence when people come out of hospital. And particularly in the national parks, you can be 30, 40 miles away from your nearest main hospital. So that really is an alternative for getting people closer to home. And then we've started to explore the option of short breaks and respite care. So if you think about where people want to spend their breaks, it's much homelier, more welcoming to be in an ExtraCare setting. And also cost-wise, from our initial work, it's about 1/3 the price of, say, a traditional residential or nursing respite stay. And in terms of the benefits, I think one of the things, if you went back to 20 years ago and kind of thought about, well, what would we do differently? I think we'd have probably had a longitudinal evaluation in place. And we've just become a National Institute of Health Research site across the council. And one of the things I'll be pushing for is that we do some longer term research and evaluation around not only ExtraCare, but also supported housing. But what we can tell is that, we feel anecdotally, certainly, that lots of people have benefited from ExtraCare. Looking at the data around home care packages and people's longevity, we can see people have lived longer. They have tended to have lower packages of care, but then for a longer period when they have had support. We know that ExtraCare has played quite a vital role in town centre and village regeneration. So I've talked about that example of Bainbridge. I can think of other locations. Thirsk is another one, Richmond is another one, where having a ExtraCare scheme has been an important part of either keeping a town centre going or giving a sign of investment in a town centre. But also where we've got new housing growth, so Sowerby to the south of Thirsk, where actually ExtraCare was one of the first developments. Now we've got supermarkets, a range of new housing in place. And then clearly also we've been able to demonstrate some savings impact. So the initial programme was about replacing council-run residential homes with ExtraCare, and we've delivered about £2.5 million worth of savings, and that's still continuing. In fact, we've got a new savings programme for the next 4 years, and ExtraCare, particularly in Harrogate, will be one of the strong features of that too. What else have we learned? Well, The picture here is of is at the conference that Jeremy mentioned that took place in November to celebrate 20 years. And you've got pictured here executive members, chief execs, officers who've been part of the ExtraCare story over the last 20 years, some of whom have gone into different roles, some of whom are in the room today, one of whom I think has been there right from the very beginning. And colleagues who've then moved on to other careers, for example, with developers and with housing associations. I think a couple of things. One is we've always worked really closely with the sectors, so it's been an iterative process, and we've had quite a lot of consistency and clarity. We've, had an established framework for ExtraCare. We've also just about going into revising that, refreshing that for 2025. We've also had a dedicated ExtraCare team. So I think unlike some other councils, we haven't distributed the work of ExtraCare around the department or around the council. We've had a single ExtraCare team, and obviously colleagues from finance, procurement, legal have been vital to that. And I think that one of the things that gives me real hope going forward is we've just become a unitary council. So we managed to achieve what we've achieved across one county and 7 districts. I think that can be much more powerful in the future, where we've got housing colleagues working alongside social care and other teams in one council. So just where do we go from here in North Yorkshire? We've got 5 schemes in the pipeline. As I say, we've got a new framework being planned for 2025, and we'll work with our partners on that. And I think particularly I want to see more involvement from people with lived experience. It was really good to hear Jim talking earlier. And then I think we need to look a bit more about what does this look like going forward in very rural areas, or areas where we perhaps need a different balance in terms of the complexity of people's life circumstances. The final things I just want to reflect on are Councillor Michael Harrison and I, who's in this picture alongside me with colleagues from Joseph Rowntree Trust. He and I did a tour of all 28 schemes last year, so a bit of a road trip. And we've just pulled together our kind of report of our findings. We've only just finished that road trip. So this is a sneak preview, and I'm not going into a lot of detail because I haven't shared it majorly with council or housing colleagues in the wider sector so far, and I'm planning to do that. But just a few thoughts maybe for the future. I think there are some big issues, some important issues about cost. If you think about the unit cost for each ExtraCare flat or apartment, we're seeing that sort of increased by 3-fold in recent years. So that presents a real headache, I think, both for councils and other commissioners, but also for Homes England, for developers, for registered providers, and also for the customer in terms of the potential costs and contributions. I think there is a bit of a debate at the moment about long-term national funding. We would like to see a longer-term commitment there beyond the current cycles, and I know that's difficult at this stage in the Parliament. One thing we're seeing is we've moved away sort of about 5-6 years ago to more of a mixed approach between rental and shared ownership and purchase. And I think we're seeing that move back again now. So most of our partners are saying that actually they could easily fill rental properties, but they really struggle sometimes with purchase properties. So I think we probably need to just have a bit of a stock take on that. As we went around different schemes, we picked up all sorts of stories about potential tax and welfare, both incentives and barriers. And that's something, again, I think we need to take stock of both nationally and locally. And then there were a raft of issues about quality. So most of the schemes, in fact, all of our schemes, I'd say, were of good quality. Some were outstanding. I think what I would reflect on is we need to start building more for future generations. So what would ExtraCare look like for a gaming generation? What does it look like for Gen Z? And what does it look like, in fact, in the near future for the baby boom generation? So I think design does need to look different. I think that not only the shape of the buildings, but also things like buggy stores, car parking, access to other facilities. I think what goes on, and I'll come back to that in a moment, what's the offer in a scheme is really important too. I think there are some interesting issues about practice. Catering has always been a big factor, and it was interesting to see what worked well and what didn't work so well. I think there's something about My general impression actually was that large-scale contracts don't work particularly well, but partnerships with local catering businesses or providing incubator units for maybe, you know, artisan food businesses, that has real potential. And I think a few other thoughts just to round off with, really. I think we saw some great examples of the interface between the NHS and social care and ExtraCare, and we saw some that were a bit average, if I'm honest. Some really good examples in the north of our patch, where we've got a sub-regional teaching trust, which has some, you know, a really strong set of community health services, roles like advanced physio practitioners, could see a real benefit with some of those linkages. We had other stories actually about hospitals often thinking ExtraCare was about care homes and actually making all sorts of assumptions about that. One example also where an ExtraCare scheme had been described as a care home, and residents had been up in arms and picketed a local planning meeting, apparently, which was a great story. I think other issues for the future are, what would an equivalent mission be for younger adults? Some of the issues that keep me awake most of night are the quality of the offer and what we do around supporting younger adults, particularly with mental health issues, autism, complex learning disabilities. And I think there's something about a conversation about the equivalent for younger adults, shared lives, obviously filling that space to some degree, but I think there's something more than that too. I think there's a conversation about vibrancy. So some of the ExtraCare housing that we have felt really lively. You'd want to be there. There was a vitality, a pulse. In other schemes, that was less present, and there was less sense of community ownership and involvement. So I think there's a role there to think about, particularly, I would say, for housing and developer partners, to think about links with the arts and cultural and sporting sectors too. And the other thing that was really stark for us was actually about leadership and workforce development. This was a point that we made to the Older People's Housing Taskforce, that actually we need to think about housing and care teams as a new dimension in the workforce approach. So actually bringing them together, new career pathways, thinking about them as one team and slightly differentiated perhaps from the housing family and the social care and NHS families, whilst belonging to those different identities and networks. Final challenge, I guess, a couple of challenges, both nationally and locally. One is, I'm absolutely convinced that one of the solutions to the future of social care is about housing with care. It was a prominent part of the white paper, but we now need to see further action to develop that over the next 5 to 10 years, I would argue. And then finally, I think it's about really hearing the voice of people who live currently in ExtraCare or who may be interested in the future. And this is a picture of Christopher. Christopher lives in the west of North Yorkshire near Skipton. He doesn't live in ExtraCare or supported housing, but he's one of our key leaders for co-production, and he's done a fantastic video, which I wish I had the technical ability to share today. But he talks about co-production being a superpower. And I think that's a really important conversation we need to have about how people who are interested in ExtraCare or who live in ExtraCare can really, you know, shape their own destiny and shape the running of where they live, but also what happens in the future. So a few thoughts from me. Really good to be here today and great to listen to the other speakers. Thank you.
Well, Richard, thank you as well for pulling it together and really giving it from a commissioner's perspective and how you and your colleagues are trying to both influence the market shaping, but also being very co-produce to engage with your local communities and residents as well about what are affordable options going forward. So thank you for that. We've got about 10-15 minutes or so for questions and answers, and I know, Michael, you've already sort of answered a few in the box. Thanks for doing that. And I also just wanted to share with the people watching. Now, unfortunately, Jim has had to move on this morning due to a commitment he has that he couldn't get out of. And obviously Helen has had to disappear as well. But we're delighted that Michael, Vic and Richard are still here. So I'm just going to sort of go through a few of them. A couple of sort of technical questions, I suppose, from Anne. Richard, are you able to share the new framework, or can you give some idea when that's likely to be published?
Yeah, it's going to be in 2025. So we've got a piece of work at the moment. We're just at the early stages of scoping it, but that will involve our housing and developer partners, but also local communities and that. So it's going to take probably 6 to 9 months for the initial phase, and then we'll be going live in 2025.
Yeah, that's great. But also, I think that will also hopefully sort of draw on both the two-way conversation with the task force, as well as what some of the recommendations may come out of the task force, both in terms of the sort of financial models, the planning, and the other incentives as well that may be sort of coming through. There was another question which was around sort of capital grants and things around issues around respite units. Now, I know North Yorkshire have done a lot of work around respite, and I know that Paula Broadbent is speaking tomorrow afternoon about some of the work they're doing on this as well. But any sort of initial thoughts on that, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, there'll be colleagues in the team who can give you much more detail. Certainly, I think Marion and Mike might be in the sessions later this week. But there are issues about what we count. My understanding is there are issues about what we count as voids, what Homes England grants can be used for. That's been an issue to some extent for both short-term NHS step-down capacity, but also for short breaks as well. And we've sort of found a way of working through it, but I think it's an area that's probably ripe for some reform. Really, I'm not criticising any agency on that. It's just needs and demands change, and we probably need to think about how we adapt policy around that.
But also, I was just struck by your sort of point around closer integration across health, housing, and social care, and those transitions. And Vic, you may have a view about where we manage those transitions across those sort of the three-legged stool, I think used to be the phrase. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very. Well, I suppose the problem is that we have thought of it as a three-legged stool rather than a four-legged stool, or somebody, a person actually. And I think that's part of the challenge, isn't it? That it's really I think some of there's lots of changes in this. So if I think there's the schemes that Richard's talking about are really fascinating and interesting, and to hear about the sort of savings levels in those kind of context. And there are some great sort of focus. I know I said about not looking internationally, but I think we miss a trick if we don't look to understand sort of where some of these changes come from. So particularly the focus in other parts of Europe around people staying at home. These are all part of a really important spectrum of possibilities. I think what we don't do very well is enable people to really understand those options, and also to have some agency in terms of deciding which one of those is suitable for them. Right now, it's very difficult because the housing schemes, the suitable housing schemes, may not be in the locality they want to stay in, and then of course they have to make very difficult decisions about relocating into places they don't know or don't feel that they're part of those communities. The care options may be really right for them, but don't necessarily have the right mix of people or that they want to engage with. And staying at home works for some people, but doesn't work as a kind, may work in waves of suitability. So I think having a greater range of options, so having some extra care that people can utilise for respite. I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? We've all been in this world a bit too long, haven't we? So I can remember lots of fantastic discussions about sort of utilising extra care and sheltered schemes for step down from hospital as a really, really positive kind of opportunity to enable people to be back in a home environment. All that is really that those capabilities remain. What we are still stuck with is we can't move the money around in a way that is suitable. So when Richard talks about £2.5 million worth of savings, where does that go, and where's the saving from, and and are we properly then reinvesting that into further prevention? And I think
Well, I mean, I remember in my early days of ExtraCare when I was at the Department of Health visiting Broadacres housing, actually, Richard, and there was some step down intermediate care facility there, but those were pre-ICS days indeed. Look, there are a couple of other questions I just wanted to touch on, and Jill asked a really important one, which is about, why are there so many empty extra care flats in development? Decent homes are left empty, unable to be sold. Is it a service charge issue? She questions, consumer confidence is low. I don't want to sort of put the spotlight on ExtraCare Charitable Trust, but are there any thoughts you have, Michael, around this? And Jim, there was a question earlier about whether it was something that Jim thought about when he was wanting to move there with his wife.
Yeah, because I thought it might have something to do with what Jim was talking about how people could be quite wedded to their home in the community, and that move to a retirement village might feel like a big leap. And actually, do many people feel like they can make that leap, and do they know enough about the retirement village and the benefits, and actually perhaps sometimes choosing to stay at home, maybe in a house that isn't really suitable for aging, rather than making that move. I do think Jim's quite rare in that case. When we met last week, I thought, well, it just looks like you just planned all this out. You really knew exactly what you wanted.
Yeah.
And I don't know if people always have those conversations. And I do think people are worried about money as well. I think actually when people are worried about their finances, worried about what's going on, they focus 1 year at a time and they stop thinking ahead. So I'm not going to think about advanced care planning, not going to think about what I might want in the future. I'm just kind of focused on what do I need? What are my most immediate needs? And I think younger people do that as well. I don't think enough people are thinking about retirement and aging. And whilst they're making that decision and doing all that thinking, then yeah, I think there are then empty apartments in places that could be, giving someone a good life.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to touch on a couple of other final questions before we draw this session to a close. Adi Inka asked a really interesting question about how would affordable housing for vulnerable groups, especially old people, receive the required attention from government. And we heard from the Minister about, the Older Persons Taskforce. This afternoon, we're going to hear from Carol Easton, who's the Chief Executive of the Centre for Ageing Better. And Vic, you may know that they've been very much promoting the call for an Older Persons Commissioner. Have you got any thoughts about, whether England should follow Wales and Scotland around that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important initiative. I've worked quite a lot with Helena Hairclots in Wales and some of the other commissioners, particularly around care homes and visiting and areas like that, and actually having somebody within government who has a strategic voice for older people is really important. I mean, I mentioned when I first started the conversation about the growing population of older people. I think there are Centre for Ageing Better does a great and fantastic job about promoting positive imagery and opportunities and employment and all sorts of thoughts around older people. But generally, as we know from the media and from TV, whatever it is you choose to look at, older people's contribution gets diminished very, very significantly almost a year on year, and particularly as older people leave the workforce. So I think having somebody, it sounds crazy, doesn't it, to have one person representing sort of this huge cohort of people, but we know that sometimes that levers change. So I think it's a good thing, and I think something we certainly support that campaign.
Yeah.
I think the other bit is recognising that when we talk about older people, we still have a very kind of sort of single idea of what an older person is, and that's changing enormously as the population of the UK changes in the context of Black minority ethnic older people who are growing as a group alongside a growing cohort of people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, alongside a group of people who are aging without children. And actually coming to a place where providers of housing care, home care, whatever it might be, understand and recognise that needs changes in models. Somebody's put change in one of the questions around use of drug and alcohol and all sorts of things. The population is changing. And Richard's superpower of co-production is vital.
That was neat.
To connect to people, to make sure. I mean, what would be the worst scenario? Creating a whole set of wonderfully beautiful, accessible older people's housing that nobody wants to be in because they have not been asked whether it's right.
Well, look, you raise issues on diversity, and that's the wicket that Abdul likes playing on. So Michael, I know you've sort of done some real work in communities around this as well. Have you got any reflections from your work across the Midlands in particular?
Definitely. I mean, we've even gone outside of ExtraCare, and one of the most recent examples I can think of is having a consultant around transitioning. We actually were working with a resident who was transitioning, and it was something that kind of, from a medical point of view, that the staff needed to know more about. They needed to know the right language to use. They needed to know, well, how do they work with other residents so that that resident doesn't face any stigma. And we kind of had to put our heads together and think about, well, this is something we need to think of now, because actually in many more years to come, this, we'll have maybe lots of different residents with a whole variety of needs. And I think you do have to look outside of your own organisation and bring experts in, collaborate with them. What should we be doing differently? What do we need to think about? And asking the resident as well, how could we make things easier? What would be different if you could choose it to be different, the way that we support you? Even just how we record. I think at one point we were just recorded male and female on our data when a resident moved in, and something as simple as that from day one might start to isolate a person. So just going back and making these changes so you can be a lot more inclusive.
Yeah, and that may also link into a question Lynn raised about how that relates then to allocations and processes as well. There were a couple of questions about finances. We probably don't have a lot of time to go into that, but just to say, if there are funding issues around the cash programme, the Care and Support Specialised Housing programme, or the Affordable Homes programme administered by Homes England, please do have conversations about the current programmes that they're running. And also, I know from sitting on the task force, we're very keen to think about what the 2031 programme will be as well, to ensure that we look at both the need for specialist housing, but also supporting more of those age-friendly communities, which may link into what Helen was trying to tease out around making best use of city centre and urban settings as well. So I just want to thank all three of you who are still with us. Michael, Richard, Vic, any final words that you'd like to share? Richard, can I kick off with you?
Just really inspiring to hear people today and to see the questions. And I think we need to continue to make this a mission for the next generation. It's really important. Home is where we start from. Hopefully, home of our choice is where we'll end our days too. And that's why this is really important. So thank you.
And Vic?
Well, I'm a bit disappointed nobody got on my robotics bandwagon. So if anybody is interested, there's a fantastic organisation in Nottingham called Robotics for Good, where you can hire telepresence robots to come and trial them in your services and settings. And if anybody's up for doing some of that, let me know. I'm absolutely fascinated by the art of the possible there.
Well, Vic, you know what? I loved what you're talking about for robotics, both the AI and the virtual reality bit. And later this week, we've got a session on co-production in using technology as well. So you've set it up beautifully without perhaps realising it. So please don't feel disappointed. It's been a great contribution. And Michael, final word to you.
Just that we need more of these, we need more of this type of housing. We need more places where people can live, and have different choices. And thank you to the LIN for bringing us together so that we can promote what we do, really.
Well, can I thank you also, Michael, and the team at ExtraCare Charitable Trust behind the scenes. We've worked closely with Jerome, Sally and Alice, and thank them as well for putting on our opening session. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and I've loved how we've talked co-production, but also collaboratively around these issues, so that we're sort of setting a scene for the past, present and future. And Richard, I may come back to you saying, can we have a blog on your travels? Because I think that sharing the insights of that will be really helpful as well. I think we have one final slide, which we're going to show now. Again, on behalf of the team at the Housing LIN, thanks ever so much for joining us this morning. Thank you to ExtraCare Charitable Trust, our session sponsor, our fantastic speakers. If you want to join us at future events, speak at future events, support us in any other ways, please do email us or follow us on social media. And the session recording and the slides and the chat will be available either tomorrow or very shortly, let's put it that way. thanks very much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you this afternoon for those of you who are joining us when we'll be looking a little bit more about marketing ExtraCare and raising awareness. Thanks, everybody.